renewable energy is set to be the way forward for rural electrification in Africa. The newly signed power purchase agreements for 27 independent power projects will finally see 60 billion rands worth of investments poured into the renewable energy space. Joining us now is Bhavtik Vallabhjee, who is the head of power, utilities and infrastructure at Absa Corporate and Investment Banking. And he's going to share more insights on this particular topic. I almost got your name wrong there after we practiced it. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Let's start with the IPPs and just the scale of power that they are able to produce. I think currently they form about 5% of the total power supply. But what is their potential?
Well, I think the IPPs have demonstrated their track record in being able to execute large, complex projects on time and to budget. And in the case of renewable energy, have been able to deliver affordable energy.
Right. Do you get the sense that the sector, at least the finance arm of things, the funding, is yet to find out a model, a way to actually quantify the risk here? Because not everyone can actually enter this particular space. Do you struggle, at least from your end, on the funding end of things, to quantify the risk affiliated to this kind of projects?
Not at all. So I think the South African banking market is matured immensely, and we've done a lot of project finance transactions, not just on power, but on infrastructure generally. So I don't think there's any issue with regards to being able to identify the key risks and mitigate them, and hence get these transactions to financial close.
What are some of the headwinds? I mean, we've spoken about the potential that renewable energy has in terms of providing access to electricity in some of the most remote parts of the continent. Why hasn't this happened? Why are there still so many headwinds and the lack of access to electricity in these areas?
Well, I think things are going to change. I think what you will find is that the days of the large centralized generation and hence transmission of projects, the big utilities doing this is definitely moving away from that to generation at load centers where power is actually required. And I think this speaks volumes in being able to get the electrification rate up in Africa. So if you look at Africa, we've got more than 600 million people that do not have access to power. And with decentralized generation, you will now be able to have smaller solar plants, as an example, or decentralized generation at the load centers where power is actually required. And this is going to help in the long run.
But this has always caused another question around, okay, so at least on your end, you do fund this project, you do fund these solar farms, but what happens when the grid actually arrives in these rural areas? Do you get your money back? Do you get bought out? There's a very gray area here regarding how you guys actually recover your money.
So I think where the commercial banks have been more prolific is actually financing the generation aspects, the generation of these projects. Generally the grid, the transmission is actually the foray of utilities themselves, and you'll find that typically most commercial banks are not extensively involved in financing transmission projects. So this is typically done by developmental financial institutions, the likes of the World Bank, grant money, donor agencies, etc., etc. Banks generally have been a lot more active on financing the generation aspects, because through the tariff mechanism, you've got a line of sight to actually pay for the generation projects. Whereas on the transmission side, it's a little bit more complicated.
Right, and in the relationship with governments, as I'm sure you engage with various stakeholders, and really those engagements to ensure partnerships that perhaps would fast track the renewable energy, the spread of it rather.
No, absolutely. So I think governments throughout Africa have actually gotten onto the fact that we've got glorious resources, right? So whether it's solar radiation or whether it's wind, or it's biomass potential, hydro potential, Africa is just blessed in a huge way with this. And if you look at what's actually happened with the cost of renewable energy over the last 5-6 years, literally you found that cost of wind turbines, cost of solar modules has actually fallen literally 20% year on year over the last 5-6 years, which means it's actually become extremely affordable. And if I look at South Africa as an example, you have the wholesale blended tariff for Eskom in the region of about in excess of 90 rand cents per kilowatt hour. If you look at where the last range of tariffs were actually bid on renewable energy in South Africa, they're around 62 rand cents per kilowatt hour. So because of these falling tariffs, and 5 years ago, 6 years ago, On solar, as an example, we started off at 2.74 per kilowatt hour, and on wind at 1.14 per kilowatt hour. So over 5-6 year trajectory, you've had tariffs falling immensely. And as a result of that, government has just seen that there's propensity to actually latch onto renewable energy and build power plants cost effectively and reliably. And so it's a win-win.
Brilliant.
So governments are generally very supportive.